Okay, welcome to our course. This is Teaching Engineering Ethics. It's a course for engineering faculty who are being asked or who plan to teach ethics or who want to make sure that an appropriate ethical component is included in their courses. You can look at the introduction to make sure that you understand the course objectives and outcomes and the strategies that we're going to use. This is Unit 1 of a total of 5 units that will comprise this course. Each unit will include some exercises for you to do in a group. It will include a dialogue amongst all of you in writing in the forum associated with the instructional software, and it will include a brief quiz, which will be primarily to provide feedback to me so I know that we are accomplishing what we want. Here's the topics for Unit 1 of our course. I'm going to begin by talking about ethics. What is it? What's its relationship to the values and personal moral standards that we all have. And because it is related to that, does it need to be taught? Why should it be taught? And even can it be taught? Then we'll ask the question about what is engineering ethics, and how can we compare engineering ethics to other types of ethics. Specifically, I'm going to ask us to think about business ethics and medical ethics. Business ethics because most engineering work is done in the context of business, and so business ethics and engineering ethics will definitely overlap a lot. If we were to represent this with Venn diagrams, we'd have a couple of circles that would very, very closely overlap, maybe not 100%, but they would overlap to a great degree. And then I would like to compare engineering ethics with medical ethics because in many ways the practice of a physician addresses many of the questions that engineering does, having to do with the well-being of our society and individuals, and the responsibility we have to care for the outcomes of our practices. We'll turn to the idea of whether or not the ethics of engineering is uniform across all types of engineering, civil engineers, electrical engineers, chemical, mechanical, and so on. They do different things. Their branches of engineering have different skills. Their clients are different. The kinds of projects they work on and so on are different. What does that say about the ethics that are associated with each type of engineering? And then we'll conclude this unit with a larger discussion about the influence of technology and the way in which technology not only has changed engineering, but has changed society and even perhaps human nature. So our first question is, what is ethics? And then, can it be taught? Now, I think everybody thinks of themselves as having kind of been growing up with certain ethical standards, ethical values, moral values being taught to them, and your own sense of who you are and your own sense of your integrity and so on is very often connected to the ethics that you identify with. So if this is the case, if we all are, in a way, schooled in ethics, how much more of it do we need, or what kind do we need? recently when I was talking to my dean about some plans that we had for revising our programs and our instruction in engineering ethics, he was, I think, approving, but also said, it's a shame that you have to do this. And I said, well, what do you mean? It's a shame. And he said, well, everybody should already have ethics, as part of themselves. He said, all the ethics I needed, I learned from my grandfather. And I said, well, I hope that our students are similarly blessed by the fact that they have been guided by somebody in their family or their community to hew to good values and have an ethical sense and act with compassion and decency and the good and so on. Actually, we're not trying to tell in our educational offerings here students about that. What we're trying to do is to guide those tendencies and those attitudes and those believings to be effectively carried through in the context of the professional work of engineering. And so we begin by acknowledging that as human beings, we are usually not only aware of ethics, but, have ethical standards that we live by and that are very, very important to us. And now we're learning the tools of engineering. Do we need to know more about ethics at this stage? What's the purpose of it? Let's consider this a little bit by reflecting on the traditional approaches to ethics. And I've enumerated 4 here, and I've used the terminology that's common in the European tradition, but I think that these 4 types of approaches to ethics are really universal. It's not limited to European teaching, whether we're thinking in the context of Indian civilizations or Chinese civilizations or other civilizations apart from the Western European tradition. I think that these ethical approaches, albeit under different names, but nevertheless something like them is to be found. And so I begin with religious ethics because traditionally this has been, for many, many people, the source of their ethical sensibility. Religious communities admonish their faithful to live in a certain way. It means, of course, a certain belief system about, what's important and what's good, the source of truth, the source of goodness, the source of happiness, and how to live in order to sustain and protect these values and these benefits and these qualities. And so in the context of religious upbringing or religious learning or religious adherence, people develop ethics. However, as we all know, in the world, there are many different religious traditions, and my religious tradition and your religious tradition may not find it easy to share much common ground. There are certain obstacles to that, perhaps. Nevertheless, we usually can discover that we do have common ethical ground, that we do have attitudes of decency and concern and care for the good and wanting to do the right thing and justice and respect. These are attitudes which are shared across almost all traditions, if not all traditions. The trouble is we don't have a language to talk about it. If I do not hold to your religious tradition, maybe the language that you find most beneficial and most helpful will not resonate very well with me. I may misunderstand it, or I may think it doesn't apply to me, or something else like that. And so for this reason, the understanding of ethics apart from religion is important. This is not to say that these ways of thinking about ethics are contrary to religion or against religious ethics. It's just that what we're talking about is a different language, a different discourse, a different set of propositions that formulate the fundamental requirements and expectations of ethical thinking. And so we can see ethics, which is non-religious, described in three not mutually exclusive, but different ways. And I'm calling them duty ethics, utilitarian ethics, and character ethics. And they each stem from a certain philosophical tradition. Duty ethics is generally traced back to the philosophy of the Enlightenment thinker Immanuel Kant. Utilitarian ethics back to John Stuart Mill, his father James Mill, and his father's associate Jeremy Bentham. And character ethics going all the way back to Aristotle in Greek antiquity. Each of these strategies for trying to permit and optimize ethical lives are aiming at the same kind of thing, but in somewhat different ways. They are not mutually exclusive. One doesn't decide that I am a utilitarian, therefore character is not important to me. By no means. But they do represent different strategies for attaining the ethical goals that are pretty much universal. Duty ethics says that ethics consists in conforming to duties, obligations, which are non-negotiable. You must do something. You must act in a way always that is consistent with a duty to which you are obligated. So this means that you have to be clear about what your duty is, and then you need to understand how your action does or does not advance the meaning or purpose of the duty to which you are obliged to fulfill. Utilitarian ethics puts the whole matter quite differently. Utilitarian ethics says, well, when you're thinking about acting in a certain way, you should ask yourself what will be the benefits of this action. Or if we are, as an institution or a company planning to do something, what will be the benefit? In other words, try to project and understand the outcome, the consequences, and assess what you project those outcomes or consequences to be in terms of benefit and harm. And the principle of utilitarianism is that you must always act in a way that will maximize the good, maximize benefit, maximize human happiness, and consequently minimize damage, harm, pain, unhappiness, and so on. So they're really one and the same, except that the duty ethicist does not think in the first instance about the consequences. You may have, for example, a duty always to tell the truth, never to lie. But it may be very clear that this duty never to lie could hurt somebody. At least hurt their feelings, do some harm. Telling the truth may disrupt something. Telling the truth may cause a lot of damage in a certain way. Nevertheless, the duty ethicist argues you are duty-bound never to lie, even when the consequences may not always be so good. Utilitarian, on the other hand, is concerned that maybe you're going to misunderstand your duty and that you're going to act in the belief that you're adhering to your duty and do a great deal of harm, and that this is what the real wrong will be. You should not do harm. You should try to maximize the good. So these are strategic differences telling us or trying to instruct us about how we should think about the actions that we undertake or that we contemplate undertaking. The emphasis is on our actions and whether our actions are consistent with duty or whether our actions produce benefit, and the emphasis is not so much on us as the actor. But of course, we must acknowledge that our role as actors is pretty important as well. And this is what character ethics emphasizes. Character ethics emphasizes rather than looking at actions and trying to analyze and assess them in terms of their ethical quality, looking at the agent, the actor, the individual, the person, the institution, the community, the group, and saying, what is the integrity of that individual? Is this individual striving toward the good? What's motivating this individual? What kinds of behaviors does this individual practice in order to ensure that her behavior, his behavior, will be consistent with the ethical norms and standards and beliefs and obligations that abound? So these are different approaches to ethics, and one can see that an individual may be informed by all of them or guided by all of them. Trying to be guided by all of them may sometimes be very confusing, and so a task is ahead of us to try to know how to sort these things out. But that's what instruction in ethics and what we try to teach when we teach ethics is mostly about. How do we sort out, how do we clarify, how do we sort of put before ourselves so that we understand it, what these possibly conflicting standards or expectations are. Are they really conflicting? And how do I, as somebody who has a responsibility to ensure that actions are consistent with ethical norms and standards, and which really are being undertaken for the sake of the good. How do I know that what I'm doing is really contributing properly to that? So it means clarification, it means understanding. It doesn't mean learning new principles of what it means to be good, as much as it means being clear about how our actions and how our plans and how our projects and how our work does or does not comport with ethical standards and ethical beliefs. The question might be, what really can be taught here? Can I teach you to be a good person? Or is that something that maybe is either in you or is not, or maybe something was cultivated when you were very young? Maybe you are a good person, but you don't quite know how to act out in a way that will express that goodness or affect that goodness. There's a conversation that Socrates had with a young boy about what it is that can be taught, and can excellence and virtue be taught. And in the conversation, Socrates makes very clear that what is taught is somehow the opening to, or the awakening of, understanding, so that the individual, be he a young illiterate boy, as in Socrates' case, or a practicing engineer, as we might meet someone, whether or not their own ethical sensibilities are brought into the process of determination and the process of thinking through the best solutions to problems. This is what we're trying to teach. This is what you as engineering faculty should be trying to teach. How is it that the ethical dimension of problem solving is not neglected, or that the ethical concerns are not lost in the process of problem solving, or that engineering problem solving does not abstract from human concerns and ethical concerns. This is what engineering ethics is. It's the conjunction of these ethical concerns with the practices and procedures of doing engineering and problem solving in the way that engineers do. So we will draw on duty ethics, we will draw on utilitarian ethics, and we will draw on character ethics, but we will not revert to a singular approach for one. We will not say that religious ethics has no place in this. We will not, as some people in discussing science have done, suggested that religion is the enemy to clear thinking. We will do nothing of that sort. We will say, how is it that truly human concerns for doing what is beneficial on all levels can be carried out in a way that is consistent with and expressive of the engineering solutions. So what is engineering ethics, and what is professional ethics? So ethics, we know, is, organized, we think rational, and we think universal effort to do the right thing, and to advance the good, and to show care and respect for others, and for the environment, and for the security of the future. And all of us are, or should be, ethical people. But as professionals, we have a specific role in doing this. We, as a professional, say that we are going to be, by virtue of our training and by virtue of our knowledge and by virtue of our commitment, more responsible for seeing that the processes that our profession cares for are done in the proper way. So professional ethics is making sure that ethics are not lost in the process, in the best practices of our profession, that they are always there, they are central, they are not somehow able to be ignored or forgotten. or abused. So all professions, whether the profession is that of a food processor or a farmer or a dentist or a bus driver or an elementary school teacher, all professions have an equal obligation to ensure that the members of their profession act in ways that are ethical. And that means explaining how certain professional practices reinforce or support or accord with larger ethical standards. In some cases, it's very complex. In some cases, it needs to be explained so that there's no question about it. In some cases, an action may seem to be ambiguous, and it's important that this action be carried out in a way that is unambiguously consistent with ethical standards. So let's take two examples of professional ethics, or types of professional ethics: business ethics and medical ethics. And I've chosen these two examples because I think they both come close to engineering. Most all engineering, as we were mentioning before, is done in the context of business. Maybe not in the context of profit-making enterprise, but according to the protocols of business, with contracts and deadlines and expectations and exchange of services for some kind of remuneration or consideration. And so engineering is largely a business, and the rules of business and of good business, of course, apply to engineering. But there are certain areas of engineering activity which are not in their formulation or in their concern business. They have to do with, let's say, the safety of materials or with the possible consequences of a certain kind of procedure, whether or not it might be dangerous to the environment, or it might have consequences that are unanticipated on humans and so on. And so engineers have additional concerns beyond business concerns, which they need to care about. And these concerns are usually defined by the very nature of specific engineering activity. So if you're working with chemicals, certain chemicals are toxic, certain chemicals are going to degrade over time. Some chemicals are going to have side effects which are undesirable, and so on. And so the engineer needs to be aware of these things, and whereas a solution that might be perfectly acceptable from an ethical standpoint within a business contract may not be appropriate because of some specific engineering consideration. So let's say that's the relationship between business ethics and engineering ethics. Engineers need to know their engineering and make sure that the engineering is not overlooked in the process of doing business or in negotiating business contracts and so on. Medical ethics is similarly like engineering ethics because, one, like engineering ethics, medicine is for the sake of the well-being of others. That's really what engineering is. Engineering is for the sake of the well-being of individuals, communities, cities, and by extension, the environment, and all those things where we live and act and express ourselves. Medicine is responsible for the well-being of people and, by extension, the environment in which people interact, insofar as it influences our health and the like. So we can see some similarities on that level. Another level of similarity is that both medicine and engineering are becoming more and more technical. And the advances of technology are influencing the way in which medicine is practiced and certainly the way engineering is practiced. And so medical ethics and engineering ethics both need to somehow understand the kinds of influences that technology has upon their practices. Technology, we'll talk about this in a few minutes, is not a set of neutral tools that we can just use and do the same thing that we've always done, except possibly in a more efficient way. Technology is much more influential over the kinds of things that we do and get to do and the outcomes than that. A difference which is waning between engineering and medical ethics is that in the past, physicians very often acted quite autonomously. Your doctor made all the decisions for you. Now, modern medical practice is becoming much more collaborative. Specialization and shared patients and so on is becoming the norm. Modern hospital medical centers are institutions with enormous reliance on shared responsibility and collaborative practices. Engineering, of course, is that as well. Engineers usually are working on a team in context with others. And so we can learn a lot from medical ethical guidelines as engineers and similarly from business ethics as guidelines. There shouldn't be a conflict between engineering ethics and business ethics. There shouldn't be a conflict between medical ethics and engineering ethics. If there is a conflict, it's something that should be adjudicated and worked out. Ultimately, there should be no conflict. So my question, is engineering ethics different from other types of professional ethics? The answer is, well, in a certain way it is, but of course that does not mean that they are incompatible or opposed to each other, or you would ever be in a situation to say, well, according to business ethics it's okay, but according to engineering ethics it's not. Or according to medical ethics it's not okay, but according to engineering ethics it is. No, that should not happen. There should be an agreement that's possible, and when there is not, the project has got to be to figure out where the disagreement seems to be, and to clarify it, and to make sure that there's a common adherence to ethical standards and norms. Now, the process is, of course, a little bit more complicated when you start thinking about the different branches of engineering. We have the work being done by biological engineers and civil engineers, chemical engineers, electrical engineers, and so on. Seems on the surface very, very different. But those differences are such that the conflict that might appear to arise should be something that can be resolved without any difficulty other than the difficulty inherent in being very clear and understanding what it is that you're doing. I'm suggesting that this is the case because all of our different ethics, computer ethics, for example, is part of a hierarchy. And the hierarchy starts off on the top level with ethics, and ethics is ethics, and ethics applies to all persons and all institutions in all places and so on. How these ethical values are to be enunciated and carried out depends on the kind of activity that's underway. And professional activity is a focused and practiced form of human activity that is destined to or aims at trying to produce some benefit or good. And so ethics needs to be understood within the professional context. Professional ethics is not a new discipline. It is really the fulfillment or the carrying out or the application of ethics within the specific purview of the profession. Then engineering is one of the professions. And we were just speaking about, say, the relationship between different professional ethics, between business ethics, engineering ethics, medical ethics. The differences are differences in what realm of activity the profession carries out, and possibly a difference in the language used to discuss the actions being taken out. There should be no conflict. Engineering ethics is consistent with medical ethics in areas of common purpose. Professional ethics encompasses both medical and engineering, and professional ethics comes from ethics. The same thing holds true for the specialties within engineering. Now, you could put it this way, that there are fundamental ethical principles. These fundamental ethical principles are sharpened according to rules of practice, and these rules of practice are defined within the professions, and defined within specific professions, and defined within the sub-professions and the disciplines within for example, engineering. But these are simply ways of showing how the general principle is applied in the specific professional practice. So the fundamental principles are consistently held, but they are carried out according to specific rules of practice. Now, the rules of practice emphasizes the acts. We were talking about the difference between duty and utilitarian ethics on the one hand and character ethics on the other. When we look at professional obligations, you may say that professional obligations represents the dimension of ethics called character ethics. Here, as a professional engineer, or as a professional actor, or as a professional chauffeur, I need to, through that profession, preserve and protect and express my own integrity, my own sense of value, my own human concern, my own devotion to the good, my own yearning for justice. All of these things are part of my obligations as a professional. As a professional, I am carrying out the actions which will have the benefits that my profession subscribes to. But I must do this consistent with the integrity of myself as a professional. So we see in this way that there's a coming together of these different dimensions of ethics. When there are conflicts, for example, between my sense of professional integrity and the rules of practice, if there's such a conflict as that, then I have to ask myself, can these be reconciled? And if they cannot be reconciled, then what must I do? The one does not give way to the other. They are to be consistent. If a conflict seems to come up, then how that conflict is to be resolved. Maybe the conflict is a misunderstanding. Maybe the conflict is not. But I should not be in the position of needing to say my professional obligation is going to be forgotten in favor of rules of practice. that's prima facie evidence that there's something misconceived about either the rule of practice or about the sense of professional obligation. So these are all on the same level. Fundamental principles, rules of practice, professional obligations. The hierarchy is a hierarchy of generality. Ethics is the most general formulation. When we get down to the lower level, it's only a more specific formulation of the same generality. It's not lower, it's not subordinate, it's just a more specific, a more specified, a more articulated, more applied version of something which in general is held. Now, the big challenge, I think, for engineering ethics, and also it's a big challenge for medical ethics, for other branches of applied ethics, but technology is really at the forefront with this, is how does technology influence the activities of engineers? Very, very easy to understand that if we go back in history and think about engineering work, let's say bridge building, and there exist today in the world many examples of bridges that are extremely old, pre-modern bridges, and they are bridges that are standing up and which are useful and really works of art. But they were designed and built in a very, very different way than we would do today. The whole process of bridge building, of bridge creating, of bridge utilization, of bridges' functions and so on, today are different than they were in the past. And most of these differences have something to do with technology. So we need to think a little bit about technology and how it is that technology influences our work as engineers. Engineering ethics became very, very much an central consideration in the 20th century, in the mid-20th century, due to a couple of events. First of all, the response to the two great world wars, and maybe most especially the Second World War, raised questions about the power that humans possessed when aided by technology that were disturbing and concerning. Whether we're talking about air warfare, or whether we're talking about guided missiles, or maybe most emphatically whether we're talking about atomic power, we realize that the destructive capability of war and the capability to implicate innocent people in the consequences of warfare were enormously enhanced, especially the shocking awareness of the consequences of the atomic bomb. Indeed, the developers of the atomic bomb were not aware of really what they were doing. And Robert Oppenheimer, when he saw the first test of the atomic weapon that he had led the project to develop, was taken aback and immediately questioned whether this was something that should have been done. But the enormous devastation, the extraordinary amplification of human power, and the ability in an instant to change the future into the indefinite future in ways that far went beyond the military objectives. This was shocking, and this raised the awareness that technology is something that is very, very powerful, which has increased our power beyond what we normally considered our ability to control technology. Think about it. If I am using a simple tool, a hammer, I am in complete control of that. The force, the thrust, the number of strikes, of course, the size that I'm able to manage. All of these are a function of my own ability and energy and purpose as an individual actor. When we have enormously powerful machines and explosives, there's no way that we can control those in the same way that we can control a simple tool. And when we add to that, they make changes that may be irreversible, and that they have side effects which we may not anticipate or we may not discover until much later. We realize that the nature of human action, and therefore the nature of human responsibility, and therefore how we are to guide ourselves with what is consistent with the ethical values and norms that we hold, is a whole new set of questions, and very difficult, and ones which, as engineers who are, working with tools and devices and designing and implementing tools and devices and using them, we believe, for the benefit of society and the benefit of humankind. We need to be especially well informed about the nature of technology. We're not controlling technology in many instances the way we think that we are. The constraints that we would like to put on technology, often we cannot. But these are questions of engineering ethics that are challenged by and shaped by technology. That's my point, is that technology, modern technology, powerful modern scientific technology, complex modern powerful scientific technology is altering what we do and the consequences of what we do and what we maybe are aware of what we are doing. So we keep this in mind, and throughout the entire course in each of the units I will be introducing questions of technology so that we can try always to keep this in mind. There's another dimension of technology that was brought to everybody's attention in the mid-20th century. Not merely the power of technology, or what you might call the potential destructive power of technology, but also our ability to sustain our humanity in a world in which technology is ubiquitous. In the mid-20th century, famous German philosopher Martin Heidegger, and by the way, I don't want to honor Heidegger as a person. In many ways, he was not an honorable person or a good person, but he developed some thinking which we must all pay attention to. And he gave a lecture about technology, and it turned out not to be about technology the way most people had thought about it, but it turned out to be about technology as utterly central to all human activity. He didn't call it the question of technology, he called it the question concerning technology, die Frage nach der Technik. Heidegger realized that what we had to also attend to, apart from understanding technology per se, was our own human relationship to technology. And what he calls for in this famous lecture essay is that we have a free relation to technology. This does not mean that we don't engage with technology, but it means that technology, neither for the good nor for the problematic, determines us. That we see technology as something which is expressive of the world where we are, of the nature in which we live, of the universe, and understand how it is that we are connected to it or related to it, in order that our own ability to pursue our ends as humans is not abridged. So clearly, technology changes the nature of action, and therefore technology changes the nature of human action, including the actions that we take individually and collectively in an engineering context. But technology may also be changing our human nature, our nature as actors. So the question of technology applies both, or to use Heidegger's better phrasing, the question concerning technology applies both to the understanding of the power and the force and the reliability and the unpredictability and so on of the actions that we take through engineering and through technology, but it also pertains to the question of our character as actors and our ability to be true to our human destiny. So this is a big question. This is where engineering and many other disciplines come together. And it's coming together within the larger high-level domain of ethics. Ethics being, how is it, in the case of engineering ethics, the question being, how is it that we as human beings, with the benefits of engineering technology, can preserve our integrity and carry out projects which are beneficial in the long run to all. This is the problem of engineering ethics, and it's not a problem that is on the sidelines. It's right at the heart of what engineering is. Engineers are ethicists, where they are teachers of ethics to us all, maybe not as professors who stand up and talk about ethics, but as people who are implementing and operating and maintaining a world which is true to the values of humanity and is beneficial. Okay, for each of our units, I want to engage you in an exercise or two, and I have included in the course materials descriptions of the exercise. I just want to say at this point that the exercise is really, you should understand that term pretty literally, exercising, a workout, an attempt to loosen up and attempt things to stretch yourself a little bit. And they're best done in groups, because in a group, the opportunity of two minds or more than two minds encountering each other and competing with each other is helpful. You can do it individually, but it's probably not as effective. When you're working together, you're going to encounter some ideas or problems that wouldn't have occurred to you on your own, and I want you to engage with them. So each of the exercises, or the exercises for each of the units, is to be undertaken in that spirit. The exercises are not tests. The exercises are attempts to work out and loosen up and stretch and expand your abilities and to become more comfortable with them and to ultimately feel better. So take a look at the exercise, and I'm strongly suggesting that it be done in a group context, but if for any reason that's impossible, doing it individually is better than not doing it at all. After doing the exercise, I want you to turn to some reviewing work, and it'll have two components. One component will have you sharing ideas and understanding on the forum for everybody, and the other component is in a little quiz on materials that we've talked about and which you have read about related to this unit or whichever unit involved. And the quiz I'll have you submit to me. I'll correct it, comment on it, and return it to you, but it will be also very helpful to me to see what it is that you're grasping or possibly not grasping in the unit. Okay, so this unit's review has two specific components. One, for the forum, I want everybody on their own to formulate a couple of questions based on the topics brought up in this unit. Each of you should formulate at least one question, but I think it would be better if you could formulate two or maybe even three questions. These are questions that you think are questions that are connected to the topics that we have discussed. Doesn't mean that they're questions that are specifically answerable within the context of this unit, but they are suggested by this unit. Then after you've formulated the question, you've tried to make it clear and precise, then you try to yourself answer it to the best of your ability. So we were talking about, say, character ethics and a conflict between character and professional integrity and, say, professional rules of practice. Supposing something like this comes up. Imagine a situation, for example, where you might find yourself in such a conflict. Try to state what the question is and then try to answer it as you think it should be answered, how you would answer it if you were in that situation. Do this for at least one, better two, maybe even three, no more than three, but at least one. Write the question, try to answer it, then post it on the forum. Then everybody should read everybody's questions, and everybody should try to make a comment on at least one of the question-answer postings, but as many as you can, or as many as you think you have something to say something about. So that's a review. That will be for all of us to see how the abstract principles that we've been talking about in this unit could be applied in an actual situation. Then finally, when you've done this, and not until you've done this, then take the quiz that's you'll find and send it in to me for comments and feedback. And I will feedback to each and every one of you with some reaction indicating whether or not I think you got the point or not. So that will be a two-way street for you. Okay, that's Unit 1. I hope it's clear what we're doing. We're going to continue in this vein for 5 units, and I think you'll become quite accustomed to the style as we go forward. Okay, good luck, thank you, and see you next time.